On a hill overlooking the Pacific Ocean, there is a place that was never built to be lived in. It was built to outlast the person who created it. Not to protect a family. Not to rule a territory. But to prove that power could stand outside of time. Hearst Castle did not collapse. It was not destroyed by war or revolution. It was simply left behind by the world. And that is what makes it unsettling. Because some forms of power do not disappear when people are gone. They remain in stone, in memory, and in the way history is still learning how to name them. This is not a story about a castle. This is a story about power, when it refuses to retreat.
On a rocky promontory overlooking the Pacific Ocean, where morning fog creeps inland from the cold water below, and afternoon sunlight arrives later than in the rest of California, Hearst Castle appears less like a private residence and more like a declaration. It is not merely stone, concrete, and columns. It is a structure built to outlast its creator, a reminder to the world that certain forms of power refuse to retreat, even as the era that produced them begins to fade. At the end of the 19th century, San Simeon was still an isolated stretch of land, far removed from America's political and economic centers of gravity. Yet it was precisely this isolation that made it the ideal setting for an ambition rooted in absolute individuality. There was no city to compete with, no neighbors to compare against. Everything could be shaped by the will of a single man. That man was William Randolph Hearst. To understand Hearst Castle, one cannot begin with architecture. One must begin with power, how it is accumulated, legitimized, and ultimately convinced of its own permanence. Born in 1863, William Randolph Hearst inherited not only immense wealth, but a belief that social influence could be owned, much like land or precious metals. His father, George Hearst, had built his fortune through mining and politics. William went further. He did not simply want to be rich. He wanted to shape how society thought. Journalism became the instrument. In Hearst's hands, the newspaper was no longer a vehicle for reporting facts, but a machine designed to steer public emotion. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Hearst's media empire expanded at a staggering pace, from San Francisco to New York, from local papers to publications with national reach. His fierce rivalry with Joseph Pulitzer pushed American journalism into a new era, one where sensationalism, exaggeration, and the manipulation of public opinion became business strategies. In this environment, Hearst's power did not reside in any official title, but in his ability to make millions of people believe the same story at the same moment. It was from this foundation of invisible power that Hearst Castle emerged. Hearst did not originally call it a castle. He modestly referred to it as La Custa Encantida, the Enchanted Hill. But the modesty existed only in words. Beginning in 1919, Hearst transformed childhood memories of a family ranch into a monumental architectural project. This was not an effort to build a home to live in, but to construct a closed world, where European history, art, and American power intersected in a way that served its owner above all else. To realize this vision, Hearst turned to Julia Morgan, one of the very few architects of the era capable of working with a personality as forceful as his. Morgan was not merely a designer. She was a translator of ambition into form. Under her direction, Hearst Castle gradually took on the appearance of Spanish cathedrals, Italian Renaissance villas, and European palaces Hearst had admired in his travels. Yet this was no hollow imitation. It was a reassembly of history through the lens of an American who believed he had the right to collect and reorganize the cultural inheritance of the world. Thousands of artifacts were brought to San Simeon. Ceilings from European monasteries, ancient Roman sculptures, tapestries, oil paintings, and furniture centuries old. Each object carried its own history, but once placed within Hearst Castle, that history was redefined. It no longer belonged to its original context. It became part of the story Hearst was telling about himself, a story in which American power did not merely rival Europe's past, but absorbed, and surpassed it. During the 1920s and 1930s, Hearst Castle became a gathering place for the American elite. Politicians, Hollywood stars, writers, and leading business figures all passed through San Simeon. But the atmosphere was unlike typical displays of extravagance. Everything was tightly controlled. Schedules were fixed. Spaces were designed for continuous impact, from sweeping ocean views to grand halls saturated with art. Every detail reminded guests that they had entered the domain of a man accustomed to controlling the narrative. Notably, Hearst Castle was never built to impress the public in a conventional sense. It stood far from urban centers and remained closed to the general population for most of Hearst's life. The power it represented did not require mass validation. It existed as a symbolic fortress, a place where its owner could withdraw from the world while still maintaining dominance. This is the central paradox of Hearst Castle, a structure designed for isolation, yet born from the desire to exert control. When the Great Depression struck in the late 1920s, financial empires across America collapsed. Yet construction at San Simeon continued, albeit at a slower pace. This decision was not merely personal, it was symbolic. As millions of Americans lost jobs and homes, a massive project on a hill continued inch by inch toward completion, as if to assert that certain layers of society would not share the same rhythm of decline. Hearst Castle thus reflected more than wealth. It revealed a worldview, one in which true power stood apart from the rise and fall of the many. Even at this stage, however, the first cracks began to appear. Hearst's media empire came under growing financial pressure. The enormous costs of real estate, art acquisitions, and an extravagant lifestyle became an increasing burden. Still, Hearst continued to invest in San Simeon. Not because it made economic sense, but because it had become an extension of his identity. From that moment on, Hearst Castle was no longer simply a display of power. It became the place where power refused to acknowledge its own limits. This part of the story ends here, at a moment when power remained strong enough to conceal the fragility forming beneath its surface. The stone walls of Hearst Castle were still rising, even as the invisible walls surrounding the Hearst Empire began to feel the pressure of a changing era. As the 1930s began, the United States faced not only an economic crisis, but the collapse of a long-held belief that wealth and limitless expansion were the natural state of modern society. The Great Depression made no distinctions of profession or status, but it exposed a fundamental divide between those forced to change in order to survive and those who believed they could stand outside the shared rules. William Randolph Hearst belonged to the latter group, at least in the early years of the catastrophe. At San Simeon, life continued at a rhythm almost detached from the reality beyond its gates. The gatherings were no longer as flamboyant as before, but the structure of power remained intact. Hearst was still the center, still controlling space, schedules, and the daily tempo of those around him. To him, the economic downturn was merely a temporary phase, insufficient to force an empire to question the way it had been built. This is a defining trait of prolonged power. It gradually becomes habit, and habit rarely questions its own legitimacy. In his personal life, Hearst grew increasingly close to Marion Davies, a prominent Hollywood actress and his most enduring companion. Though never formalized in legal terms, their relationship played a structural role in life at Hearst Castle. Davies was not simply a guest. She was part of the power ecosystem at San Simeon, helping sustain its social atmosphere, linking Hearst to the entertainment world, and softening the otherwise rigid image he projected. Behind this outward stability, however, the Hearst Empire began to show signs of systemic fatigue. A newspaper business model built on constant expansion and aggressive spending proved less viable as advertising revenue declined and readers tightened their budgets. Papers that had once generated immense profits became financial liabilities. Hearst, long accustomed to imposing his will on the market, was forced to confront a new reality. Influence over public opinion did not guarantee immunity from economic law. These tensions sharpened as the American political landscape shifted. The rise of Franklin D. Roosevelt and the New Deal placed Hearst in direct opposition to the federal government. Through his publications, Hearst deployed the full force of his media empire to attack Roosevelt, portraying state intervention as a threat to free enterprise and the social order he believed in. This was not merely a policy debate. It was a clash between two conceptions of power, one rooted in personal wealth and media influence, the other in state authority legitimized by crisis. Within this context, Hearst Castle became a psychological defensive space. As Hearst's political influence in Washington waned, San Simeon was increasingly cultivated as an alternative world where his authority remained unquestioned. Continuing to maintain and expand the complex no longer served a practical purpose. It became an act of self-assertion, a way of declaring that no matter how the outside world changed, the order here would not. But power, when it loses the ability to adapt, begins to reveal its conservative core. Hearst grew increasingly resistant to dissenting voices, even from trusted financial advisors. Warnings about mounting debt, the need to sell assets, or to restructure the media empire were often dismissed. In Hearst's mind, retreat was not a strategy, it was an admission of failure. And failure, for a man who had fashioned himself as a symbol of absolute success, was unacceptable. This contradiction was inscribed directly into the architecture of Hearst Castle itself. Grand halls designed to overwhelm, long corridors filled with artifacts from disparate civilizations, all evoked a sense of permanence. Yet that permanence came at an ever-increasing cost. A vast staff, complex maintenance demands, and the transport and preservation of priceless artworks required enormous resources. With each passing day, San Simeon was not only a symbol of power, but a measure of the price paid when power refuses to simplify. For those invited during this period, the experience of Hearst Castle carried a different tone than in earlier decades. The luxury remained, but the atmosphere had changed. Conversations grew more cautious, gatherings more ceremonial than indulgent. Power was no longer expressed through effortless confidence, but through tight control, almost tinged with anxiety. It was the sign of a system striving to preserve the appearance of stability while its foundations were already beginning to shift. Yet it was precisely in this period that Hearst Castle most clearly revealed its role as a psychological symbol. It spoke not only of wealth, but of the fear of losing influence. Every stone laid, every room completed, functioned as a denial of the reality that Hearst's media power was increasingly fragmented by new forces, from the federal government to changing patterns of mass consumption. This part of the story ends when the contradiction between image and reality could no longer be fully concealed. Hearst had not yet collapsed, but he no longer occupied an unchallengeable position. Hearst Castle still stood firm on the hill, but for the first time, it resembled a fortress on the defensive, rather than a palace of victory. By the late 1930s and early 1940s, William Randolph Hearst was no longer confronting a cyclical crisis, but a structural shift in the nature of power in the United States. The world was moving steadily toward total war, and within that context, the forms of influence that had once defined Hearst's dominance began to fall out of sync. War did not merely redraw the global political map, it reshaped how American society consumed information, understood authority, and assigned moral legitimacy. During these years, Hearst still controlled a vast newspaper network, but print journalism no longer held the uncontested position it once had in national life. Radio, and later early television, emerged as faster, more immediate, and far more difficult channels of communication to control. For a man accustomed to shaping public opinion through printed words and sensational headlines, this represented a fundamental challenge. Hearst's power, once grounded in his ability to dictate the rhythm of information, began to fragment. Within this shifting landscape, Hearst's political positions grew increasingly controversial. His isolationist views and skepticism toward international intervention which had resonated with segments of the public during the interwar years, now appeared outdated as global threats became unmistakable. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, the United States entered World War II with a renewed sense of unity, and in that atmosphere, Hearst's voice no longer carried the same directive force. He continued to write. He continued to issue instructions to his editors. But his influence was no longer absolute. It was precisely as his public power declined that Hearst Castle assumed greater importance in his private life. San Simeon ceased to be merely a retreat or a place for hosting guests. It became a psychological refuge, a space where Hearst could reassert himself as a central figure, even as the world beyond no longer revolved around him. Familiar rituals were repeated there: formal dinners, fixed daily schedules, and the presence of a consistent circle of guests, all reinforcing an illusion of stability in an era defined by upheaval. That stability, however, grew increasingly performative. The finances of the Hearst Empire continued to deteriorate. Debt accumulated, assets were mortgaged, and pressure from banks forced Hearst to confront decisions he had long avoided. The discreet sale of real estate and art objects marked a critical psychological turning point. For a man who had spent his life acquiring and displaying, the act of selling was not merely a financial adjustment, but an acknowledgement that power was no longer expanding through momentum alone. In these negotiations, Hearst no longer held the upper hand. Financial institutions that had once been cautious in the face of his media influence now acted with greater confidence, aware that his ability to shape public opinion had weakened. When no longer supported by fear or reverence, quickly loses its deterrent force. This was the moment when the empire began to erode from within, not through sudden collapse, but through a series of small concessions, each narrowing the scope of control. On a personal level, Hearst's health also began to decline. Strokes and cardiovascular problems forced him to slow his pace, even as he refused, mentally, to accept the role of a man past his peak. His growing reliance on aides and advisors exposed the widening gap between the image of indestructible authority he sought to maintain and the fragile reality of aging. Hearst Castle, with its long staircases and sprawling spaces, unintentionally mirrored this contradiction, a structure designed for spectacle, increasingly ill-suited to a weakening owner. His relationship with Marion Davies also shifted in tone during this period. Davies remained a loyal companion, but her role gradually moved from social symbol to caretaker and intermediary. She helped ease tensions, shield Hearst from certain external pressures, and preserve the social connections necessary to prevent San Simeon from becoming entirely isolated. Even so, her presence could not reverse the prevailing sense that an era was drawing to a close. The architecture of Hearst Castle took on a new meaning during the war years. Construction all but stopped, not only due to financial constraints, but because the social climate no longer supported projects of such overt grandeur. Unfinished structures and unrealized plans by Julia Morgan became physical remnants of an interrupted ambition. Unlike European palaces completed over generations, Hearst Castle halted mid-course, like a story unable either to conclude or to continue. To outside observers, Hearst's decline did not resemble a dramatic downfall. It unfolded quietly, over time, and was therefore easy to overlook. Yet it was precisely this quietness that made the story more compelling. Power rarely disappears overnight. It retreats step by step, often while its owner still believes he remains in control. This part of the story ends on an unresolved note. Hearst was still alive. Hearst Castle still stood. The media empire still existed in name, but the balance had shifted. The world Hearst had once shaped was moving toward a new order, one in which power concentrated in a single individual was no longer a sustainable model. San Simeon, once a symbol of limitless expansion, gradually became a space of memory and resistance to change. When the war ended, and the United States entered the period of post-World War II reconstruction, William Randolph Hearst, was no longer the man who believed he could bend national opinion with a single front. Page headline: The world after 1945 left little room for personal media empires operating as private kingdoms. Power shifted toward collective institutions, state authorities, and new forms of media that demanded speed, objectivity, and modes of control fundamentally different from the age of print dominance. What is most striking, however, is not that Hearst lost power, but the way he refused to acknowledge its retreat. At San Simeon, the pace of life slowed markedly. Grand parties became rare, guest lists grew shorter, and rituals once sustained as essential elements of social power began to feel nostalgic. In this period, Hearst Castle ceased to function as a stage for national influence, and instead became a repository of memory, a place preserving an era in which its owner had believed power to be permanent. Long corridors and art galleries no longer overwhelmed in the same way. They grew quiet, as if the space itself recognized that its role had changed. Legally and financially, this transition took form through agreements Hearst was compelled to accept. Debt restructuring, the transfer of effective control over many assets to financial institutions, and the increasing autonomy of the Hearst Corporation as an entity separate from Hearst himself marked a historical turning point. The empire bearing his name did not vanish, but it detached from him. For a man who had long equated his identity with the power he created, this was the most painful form of withdrawal. In the final years of his life, Hearst lived increasingly withdrawn. Declining health limited his mobility, and trips to Hearst Castle became shorter and less frequent. San Simeon, once built as the center of his private world, now resembled a physical memory rather than a place of command. Power was no longer exercised there, it was merely recalled. And it was precisely this transformation that placed Hearst Castle in its most precarious phase of existence, when a symbol loses its original function but retains its full form. After Hearst's death in 1951, the central question was no longer his personal fate, but the fate of the structure to which he had devoted more than 3 decades. What becomes of a castle born from personal power once that individual is gone? The answer emerged through a long, gradual process of institutionalization. Confronted with overwhelming financial burdens and immense maintenance costs, the Hearst family made a historic decision to transfer Hearst Castle to California state parks. This decision was not merely a real estate transaction. It represented a fundamental shift in meaning. Hearst Castle moved from being a symbol of private power to a public asset. Spaces once tightly controlled were open to the public. Rooms designed to impress elites now welcomed tourists, students, and scholars. The transition carried a deep paradox. Power originally built on separation now survived through accessibility. Yet becoming a historic site did not strip Hearst Castle of its symbolic weight. On the contrary, it sharpened the central question the structure poses: what happens when power refuses to retreat at the right moment? The stone walls, vast art collections, and monumental scale of San Simeon no longer testify to invincibility. They stand as evidence of an era in which personal power believed it could transcend all historical limits. In its new role, Hearst Castle has been reinterpreted. Guided tours, preservation records, and academic research no longer focus solely on extravagance, but on the social, political, and economic conditions that made such a structure possible. Visitors no longer encounter a fairy-tale castle, but the traces of a quiet conflict between individual ambition and the momentum of historical change. This reinterpretation transforms Hearst Castle into a living historical lesson rather than a mere tourist destination. The final chapter of Hearst's life and the transformation of San Simeon leads to an unsettling conclusion. Power rarely disappears entirely. It changes form. In this case, Hearst's personal power dissolved, but the symbolic power of the structure he left behind continued to exist, perhaps even more forcefully in the collective imagination. Hearst Castle is no longer a place where power is exercised, but it is a place where power is remembered, analyzed, and contested. This part of the story ends as power finally withdraws from the individual, but not from stone or memory. San Simeon remains, no longer belonging to one man, but to history itself, a reminder that power may refuse to retreat within a single lifetime, but it can never escape the judgment of time. When Hearst Castle entered public life as a historic site, it did not become harmless. On the contrary, opening its gates to the public activated a new phase of existence, one in which William Randolph Hearst's power was no longer exercised directly, yet continued to operate through discourse, memory, and debate. A structure once built to control the narrative now became the center of countless competing interpretations, and it is precisely this plurality of voices that has made Hearst's legacy more difficult to define than ever before. In the decades following William Randolph Hearst's death, American society underwent profound shifts in culture and historical consciousness. Attitudes toward elites, toward extreme concentrations of wealth, and toward personalized media power grew increasingly skeptical. Within this climate, Hearst Castle was no longer viewed solely as an architectural marvel. It became a case study, a place where questions were asked about the boundary between individual vision and ostentation, between cultural heritage and social inequality. Guides at San Simeon do more than recite the dimensions of grand halls or the monetary value of art collections. They speak of the man behind the structure, and of an era in which media power could be personalized to an almost feudal degree within a society that defined itself as democratic. Each room, each corridor becomes a chapter in a larger story, where architecture reflects not only aesthetic ambition, but the power structures of the era that produced it. This becomes especially evident when Hearst Castle is placed in dialogue with Hollywood and popular culture. The figure of William Randolph Hearst, though never appearing directly on screen, continues to haunt American cinema through fictional portrayals of powerful magnates. Citizen Kane, directed by Orson Welles, has long been regarded as a distorted, yet incisive mirror of Hearst's life. Though the film was released while Hearst was still alive and did not use Hearst Castle as its literal setting, the spirit of San Simeon, its isolation, boundless ambition, and fear of losing power permeates every frame of the film. Hearst's furious response to Citizen Kane, from mobilizing his newspaper empire to applying pressure in an attempt to block its release, only sharpened a central paradox: media power can shape public opinion, but it cannot fully control how history will remember a person. When Citizen Kane became a landmark of world cinema, Hearst's image indirect, though it became frozen within a narrative he no longer had the ability to alter. From that point on, Hearst Castle itself was increasingly viewed through this lens, as a real-world Xanadu, a place built to resist oblivion, yet ultimately transformed into its symbol. Within academic circles, Hearst Castle has been examined as a paradigmatic example of architecture of power in 20th century America. Unlike European castles constructed over generations to serve dynasties, San Simeon is inseparably bound to a single individual. This makes it a powerful symbol, but also one vulnerable to reduction. Historians, architects, and sociologists continue to debate whether Hearst Castle should be understood primarily as an independent artistic achievement or as an expression of extreme concentration of power and wealth. That debate has never reached full consensus, and perhaps that is precisely what gives Hearst Castle its durability as a historical object. A structure truly dies only when it no longer provokes questions. San Simeon, by contrast, continually forces confrontation with issues that extend beyond architecture itself: the role of media in democracy, the ethical limits of personal ambition, and the ways societies choose to preserve controversial symbols. For contemporary visitors, the experience of Hearst Castle is often double-edged. On one hand, there is awe at its beauty, scale, and meticulous craftsmanship. On the other, there is a subtle unease, an awareness that this splendor was created within a world where power and resources were unevenly distributed. That discomfort is not incidental. It reflects the internal contradiction of Hearst Castle itself, a masterpiece born from social conditions that many today are no longer willing to accept. This part of the story ends not with a final judgment, but with an ongoing conversation. Hearst Castle is no longer a tool of power, yet it has not become a neutral relic. It exists as an open text reread and reinterpreted by each generation. The power Hearst once wielded has withdrawn from political and media life, but its psychological residue continues to shape how we think about wealth, influence, and historical responsibility. In the final stage of this story, Hearst Castle is no longer seen as a structure belonging solely to the past, but as a mirror extending into the present. As academic debates settle and guided tours become a familiar part of California's cultural life, San Simeon assumes a role that William Randolph Hearst himself may never have imagined, a space through which modern society reflects on its relationship with power. What is striking is that Hearst Castle has not been domesticated in the way many historic sites eventually are. It has not been reduced to a fairy tale of wealth, nor condemned outright as a simple symbol of excessive ambition. Instead, it exists in a state of ambiguity. For some, it represents the pinnacle of personal artistic vision, evidence of the ability to mobilize resources and intellect during an era of explosive growth. For others, it stands as material proof of imbalance of a world in which a single individual could accumulate and display the heritage of multiple civilizations as private possession. This ambiguity is precisely what sets Hearst Castle apart from traditional monuments of power. Unlike European royal palaces, where authority was legitimized through dynasty and ritual, San Simeon was built within a democratic society, one in which power is theoretically vested in the public. Its very existence raises an uncomfortable but necessary question: does democracy truly prevent the concentration of power, or does it merely alter the form that power takes? Within the context of modern media, this question becomes even sharper. William Randolph Hearst understood better than most the force of controlling a narrative. Today, media power has fragmented, spreading across digital platforms and algorithmic systems. Yet the core principle Hearst embodied, the ability to shape collective perception, has never disappeared. It has merely changed hands. Standing inside the great halls of Hearst Castle, one is not only looking backward, but instinctively comparing past and present, recognizing that today's castles are no longer built of stone, but of data, networks, and invisible influence. From this perspective, Hearst Castle becomes a lesson that transcends its time. It demonstrates that power rarely withdraws completely of its own accord. When it can no longer dominate directly, it seeks survival through symbols, memory, and cultural influence. San Simeon is no longer a center of command, yet it continues to shape how society tells the story of Hearst, of journalism, and of the relationship between wealth and civic responsibility. This concluding reflection also invites a less extreme reassessment of William Randolph Hearst himself. He was not merely a manipulator or a singular genius of power. He was a product of an era that believed in limitless expansion and in the capacity of individuals to transcend collective limits. In that sense, Hearst Castle was not an aberration, but a concentration of a logic that society once accepted and encouraged. Judging it solely by contemporary moral standards risks missing its greatest value, its ability to reveal how the past has shaped the present. When leaving San Simeon, what lingers is not the question of whether Hearst was right or wrong, but a deeper one: how will modern society confront new forms of power more subtle, yet no less persistent? Hearst Castle offers no answers. It provides context, reminding us that every form of power that once believed itself permanent leaves traces, and that those traces inevitably return to be reread and reinterpreted. The dark story of Hearst Castle, therefore, does not end on a hill overlooking the Pacific Ocean. It continues in the way we speak about media, about wealth, and about the limits of personal ambition in a society that constantly defines itself as progressive. Power may retreat from individuals and from direct political control, but it rarely disappears entirely. It remains quietly in stone, in memory, and in the questions history refuses to let us ignore. As the 21st century begins, Hearst Castle no longer belongs to the age of print newspapers, hilltop estates, or personal empires built from land and stone. Yet the paradox is that the spirit of power that gave birth to San Simeon has never disappeared. It has only changed form, more refined, more flexible, and far less visible in material terms. If Hearst Castle symbolizes an era in which power required physical space to assert its existence, the modern world demonstrates that power no longer needs castles in order to dominate. In an age of data, algorithms, and digital platforms, power is not built with columns and grand halls, but with the ability to control flows of information, emotion, and attention. William Randolph Hearst understood that whoever controls the narrative controls perception. That principle has not become obsolete. It has simply been automated. What Hearst once achieved through editors, headlines, and bold print is now executed by code, recommendation systems, and behavior optimization models. Within this context, Hearst Castle becomes a historical point of reference. It allows us to recognize that power does not need to be openly personalized in order to endure. In fact, modern power is most effective when it is invisible, when those affected do not realize they are being guided. Hearst, for all the spectacle of San Simeon, still required physical presence to confirm his status. The new Hearsts of the digital age do not. They do not build castles on hills. They build ecosystems within the daily lives of billions. For this reason, returning to Hearst Castle today is not merely an act of preservation. It is the preservation of a moral benchmark. San Simeon represents a form of power that could still be seen, measured, and pointed to. It had a location, a scale, and a maintenance cost, and therefore could be questioned. Modern power, by contrast, is far more dispersed and elusive. It leaves behind no single structure for history to judge. This distinction gives Hearst Castle a unique educational value. It reminds us that power, while it still requires display, retains vulnerability. It needs recognition. It needs admiration. It needs space to exist. Once power no longer requires those things, its capacity for control becomes deeper, but also far more difficult to challenge. Seen in this light, San Simeon is not merely the remnant of a fallen empire, but a warning about empires still in formation. At a deeper level, the final movement of this story raises a personal question. William Randolph Hearst built Hearst Castle not only to project power outward, but to convince himself that his influence was permanent. In the modern world, where power operates rapidly and abstractly, that need for self-assurance has not vanished. It is now expressed through growth metrics, influence charts, and constant digital presence. Hearst Castle thus becomes a symbol of a more universal fear, the fear of being forgotten. As the story closes, Hearst Castle remains as a silent object, no longer issuing commands, no longer exerting control, yet still asking questions. Not questions about William Randolph Hearst, but about ourselves. How will modern society confront power when it no longer has a visible form? Will we preserve it, critique it, or normalize it? And when material symbols disappear, what will history rely on to tell stories of influence and responsibility? The dark story of Hearst Castle ends here, not with a sealed conclusion, but with a deliberate void. That void is left for the viewer, the reader, and for this era itself. Because power, in whatever form it takes, only truly ends when society learns to recognize it before it finishes building its castle. There is a moment that most visitors experience when leaving Hearst Castle. It does not occur while standing before the Neptune pool or inside the most lavish grand hall, but later when the vehicle begins its descent from the hill, when the castle gradually disappears into the fog, and only the Pacific horizon remains. In that moment, awe gives way to something harder to name, the sense that one has passed through a story that never truly ends. In its final state, Hearst Castle is no longer a place where power is exercised, but a place where power is exposed. No orders are issued here anymore. No newspaper headlines are decided in its living rooms. No politicians seek endorsement over private dinners. Yet it is precisely this absence that clarifies what the structure has always represented: the desire to leave an indelible mark on history. William Randolph Hearst was not the only figure in history to carry such a desire. But he was among the few who, within a democratic society, managed to construct a personal symbol of power approaching the scale of old-world dynasties. This was only possible at a specific moment in American history, when personal wealth, mass media, and faith in exceptional individuals converged. Hearst Castle is the material crystallization of that moment, and for that reason, one of the clearest demonstrations of its limits. When power is active, it always creates the illusion of inevitability. For much of his life, Hearst believed his influence was natural, the logical result of talent, vision, and effort. But viewed from historical distance, what becomes clearer is the fragility of all structures built on personal power. Hearst Castle was not destroyed. It did not collapse through war or revolution. It was simply left behind by its time. And it is this quiet abandonment that gives the story greater depth than any dramatic downfall. At its deepest level, this conclusion is no longer about Hearst himself, but about how societies choose to remember power. Preserving Hearst Castle does not mean unconditional celebration. It is an act of preserving a question about how we treat legacies built upon unequal distributions of power and resources. To destroy them may erase the trace, but it also erases the lesson. To preserve them forces confrontation, again and again, with what history refuses to allow us to forget. Today, Hearst Castle exists within that tension. It is no longer a symbol of triumph, but neither is it a simple indictment. It stands as a document in stone, reread differently by each generation. For some, it is a story of ambition and creativity. For others, a story of concentrated power and its cost. No single interpretation is final. And perhaps that, above all, is the most enduring legacy of San Simeon. If Hearst's power once believed it could defeat time through scale and extravagance, history has delivered a different answer, not through destruction, but through transformation. Power leaves the individual, but memory remains, no longer to rule, but to warn. No longer to command, but to compel reflection. The dark story of Hearst Castle ends here, not with the image of a glorious palace, but with a silence. And within that silence, a question continues to echo beyond San Simeon, beyond the 20th century. When the power of our own era leaves its traces, how will it be remembered? As an achievement, a failure, or simply as proof that no power is large enough to escape the judgment of time?